And as we celebrate the man who waited decades to be a monarch, spare a thought for his grandson, 11-year-old Prince George.
She shaped the early life of the future king and vanished without a trace. But what she did next shook the palace to its core. For nearly a decade, Maria Teresa Turrion Borrallo was the most trusted figure in Prince George's life. Though her name remained unknown to most, behind the gates of Kensington Palace, she was more than just a nanny. She was a quiet force of love, discipline, and stability in a world where every step of a child's life was scrutinized, calculated, and guarded. She was his constant, the person who stood just out of the camera frame, the one who whispered, "Be kind," before school, who packed his bag with snacks and secrets, and who sang lullabies from a homeland far from Buckingham. But then she was gone. No public announcement, no heartfelt statement from the palace. No smiling farewell photo. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. Royal insiders called it an expected transition, but those who knew, who really paid attention, were stunned. Maria hadn't just cared for the young prince she had helped shape his soul. And then, without warning, she walked away from it all. Or so it seemed. The truth, as it always is, in royal affairs, was far more complicated. Behind the polished smiles and well-pressed school uniforms, something had shifted. Not just in George's world, but in the walls of the monarchy itself. A quiet restructuring, a subtle change of guard. The future king was growing up, and with him came a shift in who was allowed in and who was being shown the door. Maria's exit was no accident of timing. It was the first crack in a long-held structure built on loyalty, discretion, and tradition. But Maria didn't fight back. She didn't grant interviews, write a memoir, or sell secrets. Instead, she retreated with a grace that only deep pain can carry. And for months, it seemed like her story had ended with that silent farewell. But what she did next? That changed everything. Because while the palace had expected her to fade into quiet, retirement, Maria had something else in mind. A decision that would ignite admiration, spark controversy, and leave the royal family wondering if they had let go of something far more irreplaceable than they realized. To understand why this quiet departure rattled the palace walls, we must go back to where it all began when an 8-month-old George met the woman who'd become his anchor. She didn't seek fame, she was trained to avoid it. But Maria wasn't just any nanny. Before she ever stepped foot inside Kensington Palace, Maria Teresa Turrion Borrallo had already been molded by one of the most elite institutions in the world, Norland College. This wasn't some ordinary nanny. School. Norland was where future caretakers of royalty, aristocrats, and world leaders were forged, where tradition met tactical training, where etiquette was taught with the same seriousness as emergency drills. Maria passed through it with quiet determination, emerging not just as a professional, but as someone who understood that being invisible could be a superpower. It wasn't enough to be competent. You had to disappear into the background while being the emotional glue of a household under constant surveillance. That's exactly why she caught the attention of Prince William and Catherine. They weren't just looking for help, they were looking for someone they could trust with the future of the monarchy. After an intense vetting process that scrutinized everything from her temperament to her loyalty, Maria was handpicked by the Duke and Duchess themselves. It wasn't simply a job offer. It was a call to duty. A silent assignment to protect a child who would one day be king, and to do so in the shadows. Her first days inside the palace were as understated as she was. No announcements, no photos, no formal introduction to the public. Just early mornings that began before the sun rose, and long nights that stretched beyond bedtime stories. She moved like a whisper through the halls, always present, but never intrusive. She organized George's clothes with precision, sterilized bottles like clockwork, and hovered just close enough to catch a fall, but far enough to give space. To the outside world, she didn't exist. To George, she became everything. Maria wasn't just following rules, she was breathing life into them. She understood the royal protocols not as cold commands, but as frameworks that needed warmth to work. She never blurred the line between staff and family, but she walked it with grace. She didn't overstep, but she left her mark in the way she anticipated George's needs before he even spoke, in the way she stayed awake through his fevers, and in the way she remembered every tiny quirk that made him laugh. There was no handbook for raising a prince, but Maria was writing her own with every passing day. Her bond with George deepened in the silences, in those unspoken moments where trust isn't taught, it's earned. While cameras zoomed in on ceremonial waves and birthday portraits, Maria was behind the curtain holding stuffed animals above the lens to coax out a giggle. She sang lullabies from her Spanish childhood, threading her culture into his bedtime. Routine. George didn't just learn how to walk under her care, he learned how to be understood without having to explain himself. Still, even in a place as gilded as Kensington, perfection was an illusion. Behind the grandeur was a pressure few could comprehend. Because raising a prince meant raising him in a fishbowl, with every step monitored, measured, and magnified. And Maria, who had trained to blend in, would soon be forced to confront the invisible weight of being the only real constant in a world built on constant change. To the world, he was a prince. To her, he was just George. From the beginning, Maria knew this boy wasn't like others, not because of his title, but because of the weight it carried before he could even walk. Yet George, in his earliest days, revealed a softness that few ever saw. He was quiet, observant, and unusually sensitive to his surroundings. He didn't cry for attention, didn't chase the spotlight. He preferred predictability, calm mornings, and routines that made his world feel safe. And Maria, with a precision honed by experience and instinct, crafted that world for him piece by piece. She learned his language before he could speak, understood that a scrunched nose meant discomfort, a sideways glance meant curiosity, and a clenched fist meant frustration he hadn't yet learned to name. But Maria didn't hush his storms. She welcomed them. Where others might distract or scold, she leaned in. "Are you angry? Or are you tired?" she'd whisper, letting him decide. George began to answer, not always with words, but with trust. That trust built quietly, in lullabies hummed from Maria's Spanish childhood, in soft toys tucked under his arm, in stories read on rainy afternoons. She was there when he first clapped to "If You're Happy and You Know It." She was there for his first word, Baba, uttered not in a grand room full of cameras, but in the quiet corners of the nursery where the world didn't reach. And as his legs grew steadier and his steps more confident, so too did their bond. Maria never raised her voice. She didn't need to. A look was enough. A soft tone, a gentle correction. And George listened not out of fear, but because he trusted her. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was protecting a sanctuary where he could simply be a child. One untouched by protocol, free from ceremonial handshakes and rigid traditions. In that nursery, Maria created a hidden world where his laughter could echo without judgment, and where his questions were answered with care, not rehearsed lines. She knew the world would shape him into a prince, but she was determined that, first, he would learn how to be a boy. One who loved animals, asked why the moon moved, and wondered why strangers waved at the car. She answered gently, always. "Because seeing you makes them happy," she once told him. It was a simple truth, one he never forgot. Yet Maria knew, perhaps more deeply than anyone, that time inside the palace didn't stand still. George was growing, not just in inches, but in awareness. The giggles came less frequently. The questions grew heavier. And, though their bond remained unspoken, it had woven itself into the fabric of his being so tightly that pulling it free when the time came would be more painful than anyone expected. But childhood doesn't last forever, and inside those palace walls, time was already beginning to change everything. While the world saw polished portraits, she saw the moments before the smile. Maria didn't need the flash of a camera to remember George's face. She remembered it better in the seconds before the click, when his eyes searched for hers, and she held up a soft toy just beyond the frame, mouthing a silly Spanish phrase only he understood. The public saw a prince. She saw a little boy who laughed too hard at nonsense words and still needed help tying his shoes. Every official photo, every curated moment, had an invisible trace of her presence lingering just outside the spotlight. The giggle behind the grin, the whispered "muy bien" that lit up his face. These were the pieces of childhood Maria quietly collected, the ones no camera could ever truly capture. There were inside jokes between them that even his parents didn't know. A funny noise they made when he finished his cereal. A nickname he gave her coat. On special birthdays, she didn't just show up, she created moments. On his 5th, when the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, Maria led him to a small table in the staff quarters. Cupcakes she baked herself, topped with sprinkles and memories. He lit up, not because of the treat, but because it was theirs. Just theirs. The kind of memory that buries itself in the heart before the mind even realizes it. On quiet days, they'd walk in the palace gardens, George collecting sticks and calling them treasure. Maria pretending not to see when he slipped a caterpillar into his pocket. There were rainy afternoons when the nursery filled with the soft clicking of puzzle pieces and the murmured encouragement of someone who knew how much a small win could mean. Their board games didn't need a winner. The joy was in the play, the laughter, the closeness. He'd lean against her as she read old stories, his hand sometimes tracing the edge of her sweater, grounding himself in the familiarity of her presence. Her native Spanish became part of his world, buenos dias, gracias, and little phrases tucked into his vocabulary like keepsakes. To him, they weren't just foreign words, they were the sound of comfort. But those moments began to shift, slowly, subtly. George started asking questions with more weight. His eyes lingered longer on the faces in crowds. He watched the news with more curiosity, understood silence in new ways. Maria saw it happening not in grand declarations, but in tiny details. The way he walked a bit faster, needing her a little less. The way his questions had fewer innocent endings and more uncertain beginnings. She didn't need to be told what was coming. With every new question George asked, Maria could feel the nursery doors creaking open to a future that might not include her. She didn't lose him all at once. It happened moment by moment. The shift began quietly, without warning, without ceremony. One September morning, George put on his school uniform, adjusted his tie with a touch more confidence, and stepped out into a world that no longer revolved entirely around the nursery. With the arrival of school came a new rhythm, one that didn't always include Maria. He had teachers now, classmates, timetables, and schedules that stretched long into the afternoon. Maria, once at the center of his universe, became a constant in the background, still there, still essential, but no longer the orbit around which his daily life spun. Yet, she adapted, as she always had. She packed his school bag with the same quiet care, slipping in a note when he had a difficult day ahead or a favorite snack after a week of public appearances. She waited by the door when he returned home, ready to help him clean the mud off his shoes or listen while he recited facts about the Romans or how caterpillars turn into butterflies. He still sought her out sometimes with a question, sometimes with a drawing, and sometimes with nothing more than a smile. But their conversations were shorter now, the space between them just a little wider. And Maria, though smiling, felt the weight of every inch. He started asking questions with a new tone. They weren't about animals or bedtime stories anymore. One evening, after a charity event with his mother, he sat quietly at the table, then asked, "Do all children have beds?" The air thickened. Maria, ever composed, gave him the truth gently. "No, not every child does." He didn't ask another question. He didn't need to. In that silence, Maria saw something shift. The boy she had rocked to sleep now carried questions that had no easy answers. She was proud, but the ache crept in, subtle and steady. Their time together was no longer measured in hours, but in moments. A quick glance during breakfast. A whispered, "Gracias," when he handed her his empty lunchbox. On one rainy afternoon, she set up his favorite craft table paints, brushes, everything laid out just the way he liked. But George walked past without stopping. She didn't call after him. She simply packed it all away, her hands moving slower than usual. It wasn't rejection, it was reality. He was growing, and Maria, who had always known this day would come, felt the sting of inevitability. Still, she remained steadfast. She continued to guide, to support, to love without asking for anything in return. But she knew every softened request, every independent task, every moment he chose to navigate without her, these were the signs, not of failure, but of completion. Her work, quietly magnificent, was nearly done. And though no one said it aloud, she could feel it. Her chapter was drawing to a close. But the final goodbye didn't come with a grand announcement. It came quietly, behind closed royal doors. She sat across from the future king and queen and heard the words she hoped would never come. The room was quiet, not the kind of silence born from peace, but the kind that falls heavy when everyone knows something irreversible is about to be said. William and Catherine didn't speak with harshness. There was no anger, no disappointment, only gravity. They thanked her, sincerely, for nearly a decade of devotion. They praised her loyalty, her gentleness, her sacrifice. But their words were clear. George had entered a new chapter. He was growing fast, surrounded now by educators, advisors, and structured development programs that no longer required the soft hand of a nanny. Maria had fulfilled her role, they said, with quiet excellence. And now, it was time. She didn't cry. Not then. Maria nodded once, listening intently, as if willing, herself, to absorb the moment rather than fight it. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "When do I stop?" There was a pause. Catherine, her eyes full of something unspoken, replied gently, "We thought you should choose, but George already knows. He wants to talk to you." Maria stood, the weight of the moment pushing into her chest, and walked slowly toward the familiar staircase, each step echoing not just across the hallway, but across the years she had spent building a quiet world around a child who was never allowed to simply be one. George was by the window, drawing. He stood up when he saw her, a little taller than she remembered even the day before. His eyes searched hers. "Mum told me," he said softly, "I don't want things to change." She smiled, that quiet, maternal kind of smile that carried everything unspoken. "You're growing up," she said, "and it's time." He didn't argue, but he didn't look away. He just stood there, trying to memorize her face, like a boy clinging to the last few seconds of something he knew he'd never get back. That night, Maria packed her things. There wasn't much. She had never collected belongings. A few books, a cardigan, a framed drawing George had made when he was 5, a worn notebook filled with tiny details only she cared to remember. The next morning, she walked him to breakfast one last time. He sat beside her in silence. When he finished eating, he handed her a small wrapped package. Inside was a leather notebook. On the first page, written in his small but careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being my first teacher." She didn't say goodbye to the staff. There were no final photos, no statements, no tributes. She left the palace the way she had lived in it, quietly, respectfully, invisibly. Only this time, her absence felt louder than any presence could have. But no one could predict what she'd do next and how that choice would make headlines across the world. She disappeared from the palace, but she wasn't done yet. When Maria left Kensington, she didn't move into another castle or retreat to a lavish estate. She chose a modest home in West London, a quiet street, a quiet life. And for a while, it stayed that way. No interviews, no media frenzy, no memoir deal. Just silence and the kind of reflection that only comes after devoting a decade of your life to someone else's future. The palace had offered her privacy, and she accepted it without question. But beneath that silence was something heavier than solitude. It was the ache of unfinished purpose, the lingering pulse of a connection that didn't vanish just because the job had ended. Not long after her departure, Norland College reached out with a new offer. A wealthy family from Belgravia. 2 young children, a staff of their own. Everything Maria was trained for. But she said no, without even meeting them. Not because the role wasn't worthy, but because she wasn't ready to start again. Her heart, it seemed, hadn't left George behind, quite yet. Instead, she took a train to Bath and spent an afternoon with a retired nanny who had once served another royal household. They talked over tea about what it meant to leave not just a child, but a world. About how you carry memories not in boxes, but in the way you fold laundry or hear footsteps echo down a hall that no longer belongs to you. Occasionally, letters made their way to her through palace channels. Some from former Norland students, others from children she had once worked with years ago. She replied to each one, not with rehearsed statements, but with the same honesty she had always offered George. Simple, thoughtful, unadorned. And then, months after she had left her post, something unexpected happened. A message. Not from William, not from Catherine, but through the office. George was preparing for a public engagement, something high profile, something new. And they needed her, not permanently, just for a few days, to help him prepare, to guide him through the logistics of a schedule she once knew by heart. She said yes, quietly. She returned the same way she'd left through the staff entrance, unseen by the press. George greeted her with a nod, now taller, more composed. They worked through the routines, the packing, the emotional preparation, and when it was over, he handed her a folded piece of paper. Another drawing, another dog. This one named Marta. Her hands trembled just slightly. Then she left again, without asking if there would be another visit. She already knew the answer. But something had changed. This wasn't the end. Not this time. Then, 8 months after leaving Kensington, Maria stepped into a spotlight she never asked for, but that would rewrite her story. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And we will see you in the next one.